Hey, oceanography class. Let's go over chapter 10. It covers a lot of material. It's going to be a long lecture. I'm just warning you. Bear with me, please. It's on beaches, shoreline processes, and the coastal ocean. So the coastal ocean is a very busy and increasingly busy place. Humans have been attracted to living around the coast. I'm sure maybe even you lived by the coast because of its mild climate, right? A lot of delicious seafood, easy transportation, and a number of population studies really show that about 50% of the world's population, which is about 3.5 billion people, live along the coastline, which is pretty crazy. 80% of all Americans live, including myself, live within an hour drives of the ocean or the Great Lakes. So as humans, we do enjoy living by the coastline. And this is going to increase. There are studies that show people are generally moving toward coastal areas, okay? And coastal oceans are filled with a lot of marine life. About 95% of all the fish caught in the ocean are obtained within 200 miles of the shore. So that's where we like to fish, commercially and recreationally, really. On the coast, there are coastal wetlands, which are a vital natural cleanser for storm runoff, removal of pollutants, and a number of really useful things we'll talk about. So we'll cover all of these topics in this chapter. All right, so how do you define a coastal region? Well, the shore, okay, I'm sure you heard that. That is the zone that lies between the lowest tide level, or low tide, and the highest elevation on land that is affected by storm waves. So huge storm, maybe even low pressure system like a hurricane, when those waves make it up landward. Okay, the coast, on the other hand, that extends inland from the shore as far as there are ocean-related features are found. Now, I know that's kind of a weird definition. In the state of Florida, then it's hard to, there almost all the landscape features on Florida are ocean-related features, but I guess it's modern ocean-related features. Okay, and then the coastline really marks the boundary between the shore and the coast. Okay, so essentially that's the landward limit of the highest storm waves that occur on the shore. Okay. All right, there's a lot of definitions here. Don't worry about it. We're kind of going to go through them pretty quickly. But this is just defining different regions in the coastal area. The backshore, foreshore, shoreline, nearshore, offshore, beach, and wave-cut benches. I'll go through these with the image just so that it makes a little more sense. So I'm going to jump to the next slide. This one, I guess you can just use for reference. Okay, let me get my handy pen out. Okay, so, and just so you know, the authors of this book are authors from an institution in California, so there's a heavy West Coast bias to their coastal regions. We're going to talk a lot about the East Coast, but a lot of the examples here are what you would see on the Pacific Coast. And I encourage you to go check out that coast if you ever wander out towards the Pacific or the west side of the United States. Really beautiful. But okay, so the shore is divided into the backshore and the foreshore. Okay, so here's the foreshore, and then here's the backshore. Okay. The shoreline migrates back and forth within the tide of the water's edge. Okay, so that's this right here. So this would be kind of like the high tide mark, high tide shoreline. And then during low tides, this would be the low tide shoreline over here. Okay, the near shore extends from the seaward, from the low tide line to the low tide breaker line. Okay. So that is the near shore, which is here. All right, so that is the low tide, and these are the breakers, the waves breaking, up to where the longshore bars are, and these are those longshore bars. These are just bars of sand that accumulate as kind of tides wax and wane on a daily basis on a beach. And they can also move or migrate seasonally. Okay. Offshore, beyond the low tide breakers, that's the offshore zone. Okay, so beyond the during low tide, you can have breakers form way out here as a result of interacting with the longshore bar. This is the offshore area. Okay, a beach is a deposit of the shore area. Okay, it consists of wave-worked sediment that's kind of worked back and forth from crashing waves. All right, and that is this whole area here. Okay, from essentially here to here. On the west coast, what you'll find a lot of times are wave-cut cliffs. Sometimes, like, you have the coastal highway that's up here on this kind of plateau or flat area. Okay, and then you park your car and then you go down some steps. And here, this would be the wave-cut cliff here. All right, and then the berm is kind of like a dry, gently sloping, kind of slightly elevated above the ocean portion of the beach that's made up of a lot of sediments. They can be the foot of where the coastal cliffs are, or where there are sand dunes. Like, for example, if you're on a oh god, I forgot the name of it. Barrier Island. Okay, and so that berm area is here. This is where we like to hang out as humans. We come out here to the beach to, you know, do our recreational activities, to lay down the tile, hang out, picnic, whatever it is. We're on the berm here. Okay, a lot of deposited sand. And then there's the beach face. Okay, this beach face is a kind of flat area. It's exposed during mostly during low tide. Okay. And this is kind of compact sand because it's typically saturated with incoming water from the ocean and waves crashing. It's packed in harder, so runners like to run on the beach face. So runners sometimes will like time their beach runs for low tide. That way they can have the maximum area for the beach face itself. Okay, and then this is the longshore trough. All right, so if you go out a little further, this might be a low-lying area before you run into the longshore bars, which we've talked about. And then this flat area here is called the wave-cut bench. All right, that kind of sums it up. Yeah, we talked about the berm. Okay, we talked about the beach face. Oh, it can also be called the low-tide terrace, another way of describing it. And the trough separates the longshore bar, which is that kind of bar of sand that shows up at the edge or the beginning of the offshore area, and that's at the end of the beach face. Okay, so what are the beaches composed of? They're composed of anything that's local, anything that's weathering down, whatever rocks are exposed, and they're weathering down to the smaller pieces and eventually into sand and being worked by the ocean, endlessly crashing on the shoreline, right? Waves on a daily basis, there are about 10,000 waves crashing in a 24-hour period. So this sediment gets reworked and worked and rounded. Okay, the material can be coarse-grained or fine-grained depending on how far they've traveled and how long they've been worked by the ocean, or even rivers. A lot of times rivers will deliver a lot of sand and sediment to a beach area or a berm, and that sediment's derived from local sources or a little farther away, perhaps mountains that are eroding at higher elevations. So local cliffs, especially in California, boulders from local cliffs that can mass waste and just landslide downwards can provide a lot of sediment for the beaches. Sand from rivers and mud, those are two key sources of material that ends up being piled up on the beach. Significant biological material can show up on tropical beaches. This is true. You guys ever been to, what is it, Sanibel Island? Ever tried to walk on that beach barefoot? It's brutal, but it's great for collecting shells. Well, that's a lot of biological material that just piles up. I just went to Melbourne Beach last weekend, and Yeah, there are a lot of shells there too. It's a great place to collect a lot of biological material. Very nice. And all of this material is always in motion and in transit along a shoreline. So the water, the coastal ocean, the waves crashing, these create currents that helps move the sand. Okay. And largely in Florida, for example, our sand is derived from eroded areas, especially eroded areas that are local, right? And we get a lot of quartz in our sand because that's the most abundant material. That's why our sand is kind of a beige or a white, like a pure white, like you would see in Panama City Beach or Destin. And if you go further south, then you have a little bit more limestone kind of included, or biological material. If you go to different beaches around the world, especially areas like volcanic areas, like say Iceland, or places in Chile or in Central America, like Guatemala or Costa Rica, they have a lot of volcanoes that are local, and so there's an igneous volcanic rock called basalt that breaks down into sediment, and you have black sand beaches. So there's a lot of variety. Hawaii also has black sand beaches as well. So depending on what rock is locally available will make up the material you find on a beach. Okay. So sand moves along a beach. It's perpendicular to the shoreline, toward and away, like kind of comes toward the shoreline and then gets pulled back out. I'm sure you've noticed this if you've been in like ankle deep water at the beach. You notice that you kind of start sinking into the sand and perhaps feel like you're being pulled into the ocean. Well, that's what happens to sediment. Okay, so there are swash waves, and swash waves kind of rush up the beach, right? They're the ones that kind of sink into the sand. That brings sand up to the beach. Backwash is when that water gets sucked back out into the ocean. That's when it drains back into the ocean. That typically erodes sand away from the beach area. And in total, like the general movement of the sand is parallel to the shoreline. So let's say this is the shoreline, right? And your water's like over here, you have incoming waves. All right, colors. All right, your sand will move in this direction. Okay, assuming that this is the direction of the longshore current. That's what this is, longshore current. And that helps transport sand along a beach. Okay. Now, this is more true in California, but some of it rings true here in Florida. But they deal with like seasonal changes to their beaches. In the summertime, it's very prevalent there. In the summertime, they have light wave activity. And so what happens to their beach is that they have a very wide and sandy berm. Okay, what that means is that there's a lot of area to hang out in, to lay in the sand, and it's kind of nice and comfortable. Yeah, we're really spoiled in Florida. We have a lot of nice sand that we can walk through. It makes it very comfortable, but not all coastlines are like that. Not all of them have sand. Sometimes they're just rocky. Okay. In the summer in the Pacific Coast, typically there's light wave activity. Then you have a steep beach face. Okay, so this is the beach face, is very steep. And what happens here is that the swash dominates. So the incoming water waves come in, and the swash current brings a lot of sand and piles it up on the beach. So you have a lot of sand on the beach because of the light wave activity. Okay. There are no longshore bars present, and that's typical. In Florida, in the summers, generally speaking, there's also lighter wave activity, and so the berms also grow a little bit larger as a result. Not as drastic as in California, but so let's go to the wintertime beach. This is what that same beach looks like in the wintertime. Look, there's no sand. No sand. This is turn your ankles beach, right? So all that sand has been eroded away, and that's because of the increased wave activity. And with increased wave activity, you get more backwash, and so there's more sediment erosion, and so you get a much narrower beach, flattened beach face that you see here, and then you get these longshore bars that are present close to the offshore area. Okay, and I don't know if you've noticed, I guess at the time of me lecturing for this video, it's November, we're approaching the wintertime, and so there's heavier wave activity even in Florida in the wintertime. Okay, so the longshore current is this zigzag motion of the water along the shore. Okay, longshore currents, that's what helps transport sediment. And it moves generally in this direction because the waves are coming in at this angle, and we'll talk about why this is in a second. But this would be the direction of the longshore current. And I know if you've had this experience before, if you've ever gone to a beach, you know, you playfully go into the water and throw the ball around, hang float, wrestle and stuff like that. Then after like 10 minutes, all of a sudden, like you look back and you're like, mommy, right? You don't know where your party is anymore. You don't know where the, you know, your chair is, because if you've drifted away, you've drifted maybe like 40, 50, 60 feet away from where you parked all your stuff. And the reason is for that is because you took a ride on the longshore current, and it's pretty slow. They can go from 2.5 miles per hour. Okay, and so the way it works is you have a swash wave come up, it dumps sand on the beach, and then but it comes in at kind of an angle. And the reason it comes in at an angle is if you see the waves coming in, they're coming in at an angle here. Remember we talked about refraction, right? And then once the waves interact with the ocean floor, they start to bend towards the shore. But the general direction is this direction from the incoming waves, and that'll create a longshore current that moves in this direction. Okay, so we call that longshore transport, okay, or beach drift or littoral drift, and it essentially transports a lot of sediment along that direction, and it occurs in that surf zone where the waves are crashing. And I'm sure you've noticed this, like if you get out of the water, you notice sand has found its way in all the wrong places in your bathing suit, pockets full of sand, and that's because the sand is in suspension in the water because there's so much wave activity, and that's the sand that's in motion. So this current really transports millions of tons of sediment yearly, okay, and its direction is dictated by the wave approach. And so like say you have let's go coastline like this, right? If you have incoming waves coming in at an angle like this, okay, the longshore current will move in this direction. If you have waves coming in this and kind of angled in this direction, then the longshore current will be in the opposite direction. Okay, but there are general trends. The net sediment movement is southward along the Atlantic side of the United States, and on the Pacific, net movement is also southward. Let's take a look at a picture of this. Okay, so here is let me get red. These are the net longshore currents along the coast. Now remember that we're talking about coastal waters, very close to the continental margins. Remember when we talked about ocean currents? These are open ocean currents. So here's an eastern boundary cold California current that moves southward as well. Okay. Now on the other side of the United States, the Atlantic coast, the longshore current also moves southward. Okay. But the Gulf Stream, which is an open ocean current, hundreds of miles away in the open ocean, moves in a northward pattern. Okay, and so all the, here are the Appalachian Mountains. These are rocks exposed at the surface. They erode away, and there are a number of rivers that deliver a lot of sediment to the east coast of the United States. That sediment gets worked by the oceans and then moves southward to our precious state here in Florida. That's why we have an abundance of sand and absolutely beautiful beaches. Okay, so there are two major types of shores. There are erosional and there are depositional shores. Erosional shores have well-developed cliffs. Okay, so rule Florida out. That's not really true here. So think of the Pacific coast. And that makes sense because where you have erosional shores and well-developed cliffs, you have tectonic uplift occurring. So on the West Coast in California and Washington State and Oregon, they have tectonic boundaries close by. They're active margins. There are earthquakes, and that pushes the land upwards. So there's uplift of those coasts, and that's why you get those well-developed cliffs. Depositional shores are our east coast, essentially. These are shorelines that are gradually subsiding, meaning that they're sinking. They're made up of a lot of unconsolidated sediment that's been deposited there by rivers delivering all that sediment into those areas. And because it's unconsolidated sediment, it'll settle and it starts to sink. So a lot of the features of the coastline on the east coast are temporary features. With rising sea levels or lowering sea levels, things get shifted fairly quickly in terms of geologic time. And so on depositional shorelines, you'll find barrier islands, okay, which we have a lot of in Florida, and a lot of sand deposits, sand dunes, and things of that nature. So here's an example of an erosional shoreline. You have protruding bits of land here. We call those headlands, okay? Remember, because of wave refraction, they absorb a lot of the wave energy in these areas. A lot of times they can have sea arches, okay? And surrounding these headlands, a lot of times you'll have coves. This is where sand deposits because the wave energy has dissipated and sand deposits in these areas. So if you're on the west coast, a lot of times you come down to these little coves, and this is where you can enjoy the beach recreationally. Then there are sea caves, which can be dangerous. Like there are places where you, during low tide, you can go in and explore the cave, but you got to do it at a specific time during low tide and make sure that flood currents don't come in and then trap you in one of those. That'd be a horrible way to go. There are sea stacks. Sea stacks are essentially just remnants of a headland where the sea arch has collapsed, and then you're left with this jutting out rock here. And then in some cases you have blowholes, and that's when we have incoming flood currents. When you have an increase in the tide, water could shoot up these blowholes. And of course, then you have the sea cliffs, and then a marine terrace, a flat-lying area up here. It's almost like a plateau. And then here's the wave-cut bench all the way out here. Very flat feature. Here, this is off the coast of Portugal. You can ride your boats around in between the sea arches. So here's a real-world example of this. Okay. Again, here are sea stacks. We've talked about this stuff already, but I just wanted to give you a real-world example. The other pretty cool thing about erosional shorelines is that they're undergoing changes. All right, this land area oftentimes is being uplifted, so tectonically lifted higher than the ocean. And so what happens is the ocean erodes and creates these flat wave-cut benches. It's a typical feature that you'll find here. It's pretty cool. If you go out during low tide, you could see all kinds of organisms that latch on to the rocks here or in the tide pools and stuff like that. But what happens is when there is uplift, this whole land area is uplifted. And what you see here, see this flat area? We call this a marine terrace. This was formerly a wave-cut bench down here, but has since been uplifted because of tectonic activity. And this has happened numerous times. Here in this picture, you can see that there's a number of different flat former wave-cut benches. Today, they're marine terraces. As you move away from the current shoreline, it's almost like steps as you're going uphill. But that's pretty incredible. It just shows you the power of how land is uplifted because of tectonic activity. Okay. Depositional shorelines, on the other hand, you're probably more familiar with these. There are a lot of features here. We'll go over them, but they're dominant on the Atlantic coast, all along the East Coast. This is Martha's Vineyard. That's my best Boston accent there, limited fake Boston accent. So here, what you find typically are barrier islands, big piles of sand that are parallel to the coastline. They're essentially just sandbars. This barrier island covers a bay, so then they call it a bay barrier. Okay, it seals off a lagoon, so this here would be a lagoon. Okay, made up of typically some fresh water and salt water mixed together. And then in other areas, some barrier islands will curve like this. We call those spits. Okay, and they curve inward like that because the longshore current moves in this direction along with where that hook is. So that connects one of the mainland and hooks into a bay. So this would be a bay over here. Okay, so you can determine the direction of the longshore current based on how the spit hooks. Okay, on depositional shorelines, you can often find tumbelows. Okay, tumbelows are an area here. Oftentimes they're only exposed during low tide, and they're typically behind maybe like a sea island or something like that. And then, like I said, barrier islands, those are long offshore sand deposits, and those are parallel to the coastline. Okay, this example here is in California. But these are the typical coastal features you would find at a depositional coastline. So here's your sea island, here's your tumbelow, here's a bay barrier, I don't know why I said it like that. Here's your spit, which curves kind of this way. Here's your barrier island, okay? Here in Florida, a lot of the popular beaches are typically barrier island beaches. Clearwater, Miami Beach, Fort Lauderdale Beach, what else? Oh, Melbourne, right? The Space Coast, New Smyrna, all those areas are barrier islands. All right, and then there are deltas. Deltas are depositional features as a result of rivers kind of dumping into the ocean. We'll talk about that. Barrier islands, this is a lot of sand parked way out parallel to the coastline. Here, these are the Outer Banks. This is North Carolina. And barrier islands kind of basically go from Virginia all the way down right where Cape Hatteras is. There's like a chink or turn in the barrier island this way, and it kind of goes down south this way. But these are very popular beaches to visit. A lot of northerners during their summer will drive down to the Outer Banks to enjoy their summer, a few weeks of summer vacation perhaps. But yeah, these barrier islands do not exist on erosional shorelines. So like in California and the Pacific West, they don't have barrier islands. We do on the East Coast. And the reason why they're kind of important and helpful, say for the state of North Carolina, is they're like the first line of defense for like storms that come towards the coastline. And so they're kind of like a barrier, and they block a lot of the high wave activity. A lot of them developed at the end of the last ice age. Okay, so 18,000 years ago, sea level was about 400 feet lower than it was today, and a lot of the sand was deposited in these areas. Again, this wasn't the coastline. If sea level was 400 feet lower, the coastline would have been further away. But a lot of sand was deposited here by the rivers. Kind of pushing sand out here, and then they were reworked by the ocean to today's configuration. And it's quite beautiful. The Outer Banks has a lot of sand dunes. The Wright brothers, that's where they tested a lot of their early models of planes on the sand dunes there. So I highly recommend visiting these areas. Very beautiful. Even in Texas, I don't know if you guys ever been to, if you just go south of Houston, you can make it to Galveston. This is on a barrier island. Or you can go all the way down to Mexico, right? Sorry. But this is Padre Island and South Padre Island, huge spring break spot. But here, yes, barrier islands, okay? They're typically separated from the mainland by a lagoon, which is like brackish water, salt water, and river water kind of mixed together. And if you know anything, I mean, especially in Florida, if you go to South Florida, and a lot of these barrier islands are built, like Miami Beach is a village of a city just built on a barrier island. And if you think about it, they're just sandbars. They're just sandbars. So you're building huge buildings on sand. It's probably not a good idea in the long run. A lot of these structures, they can be destroyed by major storms and the ocean as it erodes away the sand. That's why in Florida, at least, we have a lot of reclamation projects where we put sand on the beach. Here's an example of a heavily populated one, especially in the northeast. There's so many people that live up there. They come and populate a lot of the barrier islands that are in Maryland and New Jersey. Right? So yeah, here's the Jersey Shore, guys, heavily developed. So it's a barrier island. Here's the mainland, and here's the lagoon. Okay, so there's a good example of it. So if you wanted to look at barrier islands on the east coast of the United States, there are more than 2,000 identified worldwide and 300 along the Atlantic and Gulf Coast. We kind of hit some of the major ones, the Outer Banks over here, but this goes right through Maryland, New Jersey, and into kind of the Rhode Island area here. But all along the east coast of Florida, and even on the west coast over here, and then on the Panhandle, also those beaches are absolutely spectacular. And you find barrier islands there as well. Some of them completely in their natural state, like St. Vincent Island. I lived in Tallahassee for a while, so I used to go down to Panhandle beaches all the time. But as well as Mississippi, Alabama, and New Orleans, as well as Texas. So there are a lot of barrier islands. Okay, so what are the features of a barrier island? Well, there's the ocean beach, which you're probably most familiar with. That is on the side closest to the ocean. That's where there's a lot of recreation. A lot of times they can be that ocean beach will have a dune behind it, kind of like a protective dune with dune grasses, help keep the sand in place. And that's true of, the Outer Banks, for example. Like you have to, a lot of times, not walk on the grass. They build like stairs so you go over the dune and not affect the dune at all, because it kind of stabilizes the ocean beach during stormy times. And then behind the dunes, you'll have a barrier flat, kind of a grassy area that will form. And then behind this, where closer to the lagoon, you'll have salt marshes. And this, there's two types. There's low marsh and high marsh. The low marsh extends from average sea level to the neap tide line, and then the high marsh extends to the highest spring tide line. I got a picture, don't worry. So here's a cross section of a barrier island, and barrier islands are actually in motion. They move because they're just made up of sand. They kind of get worked by the ocean over and over again, and over time, because of rising sea levels, they're kind of migrating towards the coastline. And the reason why we know this, one is we've been able to track this over, aerial photography for decades. But two, what typically happens, so here's your ocean beach here, here's your dune, right? Your barrier flat right behind that. And then this is your salt high marsh and your salt low marsh. And then here's your lagoon, right? And here's the mainland. In the lagoon areas and the salt marsh areas, those are highly productive areas. I don't know if you go back there. A lot of times you go to the bay side of a barrier island, it always smells kind of like fishy and gunky. That's because there's a lot of biological activity occurring there. A lot of plants, like living and dying things, being buried in the lagoon, and that leaves what we call peat deposits, organic rich deposits, so peat beds, which are right here. And those form in the lagoon. And so what happens is, as the barrier island slowly gets pushed back towards the mainland, a lot of times those peat deposits can start eroding and showing up on the ocean beach in the front side of the barrier island, which isn't good, because then it kind of, it makes the water kind of filled with organic rich gunky material, so not very pleasant for people who are trying to enjoy a beach, a recreational beach. So that's why there's a big effort in moving a lot of sand that has eroded away to the front of the ocean beach. But it costs a lot of money. Okay, another feature that we find in depositional shorelines are deltas. And deltas are deposits that form when rivers just barf all this sediment out into the open ocean. Here's the biggest river delta in the United States. This is the Mississippi River Delta. This is the Bird's Foot Delta, a portion of the delta that's dumping a lot of sediment from the Midwest that's eroding away and being pushed into the Gulf of Mexico. It gets its name because it looks like a bird foot, right? Caw-caw. And so here is the satellite image. You can see a lot of suspended sediment in the ocean. And so the way it forms essentially is as the sediment is like a conveyor belt, and the river brings a lot of sediment to this area. As soon as it hits the open ocean, the velocity of the river drops, and then the sediment load drops. And so it drops and deposits sediment here. But if it does that for long enough, it'll choke this portion of the river, and then the river will find a new pathway into the ocean, and that becomes a new distributary. Those are just branching channels that carry sediment to the ocean. And so that's why when you look at a river delta like this, you can see that there's a bunch of distributaries or branching channels that lead to the ocean. So you're delivering sediment to a number of different areas. And so these are landform features, and they start getting populated by salt-tolerant plant species, and grows over time. Other deltas so the Mississippi Delta is an example of a delta where it's actually growing, like the sediment being deposited in the ocean is actually occurring faster than it being kind of worked by the longshore current of the ocean and being pushed around by that sediment. Whereas the Nile River Delta, which is in Egypt, okay, so this is a north flowing river, dumps out into the Mediterranean Sea. They have, this delta doesn't form like the Bird's Foot Delta. It's more of like a smooth coastline. And the reason is because the sediment that's delivered from the Nile River gets dispersed and moved quickly by the longshore current. It's not enough sediment that's reaching the river delta. And the reason for that is because a number of areas on the Nile River have been dammed, and so they've impeded the flow of sediment, or the natural flow of sediment, into the Mediterranean. So that's why the Nile Delta looks a little different. In fact, it's actually currently eroding. Okay, in California, all right, this is a California-centric book, but in California, they have this thing called the beach compartments. And in areas in California, there are three major components to these compartments. There are rivers. Number one, rivers supply sediment to the beach. Then there's the beach itself, where all that sediment accumulates to form like a berm, right? But then there's the ocean working that beach and kind of stealing that sediment along the longshore current, and then it delivers that sediment to these offshore submarine canyons in deeper water. And that's the natural process of how sand is kind of transported along the coastline in California. Now the problem is a lot of the rivers that deliver sediment in California have been dammed up to create reservoirs or diverted, for agricultural use and for just municipal water use. But so what that creates is a problem we call beach starvation. And so that blocks the supply of sand to these beach compartments. Okay, so here's an example of one. Here's Santa Barbara. This is considered one beach compartment here. Okay, so the rivers deliver sand here, and then the sand kind of moves along the coastline here, and then comes out to these deeper submarine canyons that are a little bit offshore. Then there's the Santa Monica beach compartment. Here's the San Pedro beach compartment, and then this is the oceanside one. Okay, but ultimately what happens is, you can see here, here's a cross section of those deep, really deep submarine canyons where the sediment eventually goes. Okay, so the longshore current carries that sediment along the beach and then down these canyons. So what happens is, if you stop the supply of sediment coming into these beach compartments, then these berms will become sand starved, and they'll actually see normal erosion rates. It's just you've kind of removed the sand that's going into that area, and so the beach will be in decline, and so sometimes you kind of lose the beach itself, which is a shame. And so that's a problem they're dealing with in Los Angeles. Okay, so at emerging shorelines, these are areas where you have shorelines above current sea level. Okay, and that creates those marine terraces we kind of talked about, those flat platforms that are backed by cliffs. And that leaves behind these kind of stranded beach deposits. And that indicates that the shoreline has risen above mean sea level. Okay. Submerging shorelines, on the other hand, this is where shoreline is at or below current sea level. And what you have here are drowned beaches, submerged dune topography, lots of sand, longshore bars. In fact, if you go snorkeling in South Florida, I used to also live in South Florida, you can go snorkeling and see 3 different longshore sandbars. And when you get off the coast, just about almost half a mile off the coast, you can see those long bars. And there are some coral reef that form, especially at the 3rd bar. And then what you see here as well during shorelines where sea level is kind of rising really quickly is the inundation of the continental margin and river valleys that were once river valleys in geologic past but are now drowned, and they're estuaries now. Okay, so here's the example of an emerging shoreline. So the whole land area is being uplifted, and then you're left with these stepwise kind of former wave cut benches that are now marine terraces. And here's the active wave cut bench, and then these will be the next step as this area continues to be uplifted. And so sea level, as maybe I mentioned before, but sea level rises and falls in geologic time. And sea level has been 600 feet higher than it is today, which means all of Florida would be completely submerged under the ocean. In fact, in geologic history, the state of Florida, or the land area that makes up the state of Florida today, has mostly been under the ocean, all right, over the past 200 million years since the breakup of Pangea. And sea level has also been 400 feet lower than it is today. So sea level, it fluctuates in geologic time, goes up and down. And the reason, there are two major reasons for changes in sea level. One is when you have an increase in new ocean crust being created, so meaning those mid-ocean ridges are really active and they're creating crust at a really fast rate, that makes those mid-ocean ridges kind of swell upwards. And so what that does is that decreases the size of the ocean basin. And so then when you decrease the size of the ocean basin, then that water kind of floods the continents. Okay, so that's one reason. And there has been adjustments in plate creation in the geologic past, where there have been times when plates have been created at a faster rate, making the ocean basins kind of smaller and pushing that water onto land. It's kind of like if you have a bathtub and you fill it with a certain amount of water, and then you change the shape of the bathtub, right? If you make the bottom higher, that's going to push water above the rim of the bathtub and starts spilling on your bathroom floor. Okay. Yeah, this causes worldwide changes in sea level. Okay. And those are tectonic movements, and we see this ultimately in places like the Pacific coast, where areas are actively being uplifted. Okay. Another way sea level can change over geologic time is when we go with major climatic changes, like when we go from an ice age to an interglacial period. You can see wild swings in sea level. Okay. Another way sea level can appear to change, at least locally, is through what we refer to as isostatic adjustments. Okay. What this essentially means is here you have just regular, Earth's crust, continental crust, and mantle. But during colder times in Earth's history, we may have had giant glaciers sitting on top of the land itself. And the weight of this ice, some of these continental glaciers can be like 4 miles thick. That's a lot of heavy ice sitting on top of the land. And it causes the land to subside or sink a little bit. And so what happens is when that ice age is over, the ice all melts away, and the land will uplift or rebound to its former position. It's kind of like if you had a container ship. You ever seen those huge ships at ports that fit those like 40-foot containers in them? They got your Nikes that are coming in from Asia or something. Imagine an empty cargo ship like that, or shipping vessel, and then it starts getting loaded with those containers, like hundreds of those 40-foot containers. The boat itself, because of all the added weight, will sink into the ocean water in the port, right? And if you remove that material, then the boat will kind of float upwards as you remove that weight. The same thing happens with continental crust. If you put a lot of weight on it over long periods of geologic time, it'll subside. And once that weight's removed, it'll uplift. And this is currently happening in Norway. For example, Norway during the last glacial maximum about 18,000 years ago was covered in glaciers, covered in huge heavy continental glaciers and ice caps, and all that weight pushed the weight downwards. But today, a lot of Norway is not covered by glaciers and exposed. So our ocean sea level is rising today, right? But in Norway, they're locally seeing sea level fall because the rate of crustal rebound is faster than the rate of sea level rise, which is pretty crazy. So everywhere else, like here in Florida, we're experiencing sea level rise. Okay, so those are eustatic sea level changes, and those occur worldwide. Okay, so here are the different sea levels can rise another way by destruction of inland lakes. So a lot of times those are also associated with ice ages because you have huge continental glaciers that create inland lakes, giant lakes, and when those glaciers kind of melt away, then a huge pouring of water can go into the ocean. We talked about seafloor spreading rates already, changing the size of the bathtub as an example. And then here, formation or melting of glaciers. This is the changing of Earth's climate. All right, when we're in an interglacial period like we are now, major ice caps and continental glaciers and alpine glaciers, they're melting, and all that water is going into the ocean. As a result, sea level will rise. And in addition to that, in a warming interglacial period, the oceans get warmer. And when water gets warmer, it thermally expands. And so if the oceans are warmer, they're going to thermally expand and also cover more of the continental margin. It's kind of like when you have like you heat up a cup of soup in the microwave and you leave it in too long, it'll flow over that water line because the volume of that water expands as you heat it. Okay, so the Pleistocene epoch, which began about 2 million years ago and ended 10,000 years ago, we often call it the time of many ice ages. There are about 4 ice ages that affected that time period, almost in the order of every 100,000 years, where we would go from an ice age to an interglacial period. And so during those changes from an ice age to an interglacial period, sea level rises and falls. Sea level was about 400 feet below today's sea level change 18,000 years ago. Okay, that was the last glacial maximum. So just to put that in perspective, like today's Tampa and St. Petersburg, Florida would like double in size if sea level fell about 400 feet. And St. Petersburg and Tampa would be about 150 miles from the West Coast coastline back in that time. Okay, so Florida would essentially double in size. The Tampa area would be considered central Florida. Okay, and on the flip side, if we go to an all-out interglacial period and Earth's climate warms significantly, if all the remaining ice on Earth melted today, meaning all the ice in Antarctica, Greenland, those ice caps, and all the glaciers, sea level would rise another 230 feet. Okay, that's incredible. The highest elevation that I know of, I think, is Sugarloaf Mountain in Florida. It's just like a big sandy berm that's in central Florida. I think that's at an elevation of 300 feet. So practically all of Florida would be underneath the ocean if that were to happen, if all the ice on Earth were to melt and go back into the oceans. Okay, so yeah, check this out. This is sea level over the past almost 40,000 years before present. So this is present, right? 0,000 years ago. Okay, and then over here is about 40,000 years ago. Okay, so our last glacial maximum was about 18,000 years ago. All right, so which was right here. So this was 40,000 years ago. We had glaciation, or things got much colder. A lot of water was being removed from the ocean and snowing on land and becoming part of the glacial cycle. So a lot of water was being evaporated from the ocean, being stored on land, and that lowered sea level to the point where, let's see if we draw a line straight out here, sea level was almost 120 meters lower than it is today. It's not really a straight line, but that's 400 feet. So 18,000 years ago, right around here, 18,000 years ago, sea level was 400 feet below its present value. Okay, so over the past 18,000 years, as we've warmed, all that water that was locked up in glaciers and ice caps has been going back into the ocean, and sea level has been rising to its present day location. Okay, so how do we slow down the rising seas of the ocean? Well, humans build hard stabilization features or structures to reduce coastal erosion. It's also called armoring the shore. But a lot of times, sometimes like humans, like when they try to do something, they oftentimes make it worse, which is the case with a lot of hard stabilization features. One, which I'm sure you've seen often, is called a groin. A groin is just basically a pile of rocks that is put into an area, and it's perpendicular to the coastline. Okay. So what happens is it interferes with the longshore current, right? Here's the zigzag motion of the sand, and here's the direction of the longshore current. So what happens is the longshore current runs into the groin, okay? And the water velocity diminishes as a result, and all the sand deposits. So what you see is, here's the original coastline. What you see is an additional deposit of sand over here, which seems like it's great, especially if your house is right here. You're like, yay, I got a bigger beach, right? But the problem is on the other side of the groin, you see increased erosion. So this here is the former shoreline, okay? And then it's changed. All the sand has been essentially eroded away because it's not like this sand is no longer able to deposit over here. So groins don't really add sand to the beach. They just kind of create winners and losers. Okay, so there's 4 major types of stabilization structures. Groins that I mentioned. Groin fields are just a bunch of groins. Jetties are really the same thing. They just kind of, they're 2 groins parallel to one another, and they usually block open like an inlet so we can have boats come in and out. Breakwaters are parallel to the shoreline. I have pictures. And seawalls are just straight up built right in front of the beach, and they typically protect homes or businesses. All right, here's a groin field. All right, so here you just have a bunch of different groins on this barrier island. Okay, and so if you notice, you see how there's sand building up over here, and then there's a diminished or erosion of sand on this side. So you can tell just by where the sand's depositing, the longshore current's moving in that direction. Okay. So sand is just essentially distributed differently, but no new sand is added to the beach. So let's show some more examples of this. Here are jetties, right? So we like to have harbors so we can park our expensive boats. I don't have a boat. I don't have enough money. But anyways, yeah, so this protects it from the wave activity that's in the open ocean. So that's why we have it. And it gives you easy access to the open ocean. That's nice. So here are those jetties. And what do you notice about the sand buildup here? Look at this beach. It's absolutely amazing and huge. These people are probably really happy about it. But over here, you actually see erosion of the beach. And so these people aren't very happy. And you can tell the longshore current is in this direction. So jetties are built in pairs, like the New Smyrna beach. There's an inlet there. A lot of surfers like to ride those wedge waves there. So here's just a reiteration of where sand is deposited on jetties and where they're eroded. Average longshore drift in this direction. You get deposition here, erosion here, and deposition here. You're just essentially creating winners and losers. And that's why it can be kind of a big fight amongst coastal communities on where these things get built. Okay, breakwaters are built parallel to the shoreline. So the shoreline's like over here. If you notice, see the wave activity is diminished. Over here you see choppy stuff, so people will park their boats back here. And so the problem with breakwaters, and you'll see in this picture, here's Santa Monica, California. This is before they built the breakwater, so here's a Santa Monica pier. Okay, here's the longshore current here. Directly behind the breakwater, which is right here, you'll see a big deposition of sand. And then, but the thing is, beyond the breakwater, then you see additional erosion over here. So again, you're not really adding any sand to the beach. You're just widening a beach and diminishing a beach on the other side. So breakwaters have a similar effect to groins and to jetties. Seawalls, on the other hand, these are the worst of the worst, because they typically built these giant seawalls right in front of either they build it on a barrier island, or they'll build them on where the coastal cliff is, and it's designed to armor the coastline and protect it, especially human developments like our homes or businesses or any communities that are close to the water like this. But the problem is that then because there's a wall there, it concentrates the entire ocean energy, the wave energy, towards the sand on the beach. So it can take one storm and remove all the sand on the beach. Okay, and eventually you lose with 10,000 waves crashing in a 24-hour period. over years, that wave activity will undermine the integrity of the seawall and it'll begin to collapse. You start seeing issues like this, right? Nature eventually always wins, right? You get rusting rebar, and then what you'll have is a collapsing seawall, and that could undermine the structures here. And notice there's a lot of loss of beach sand over here. So generally not a great idea. It's better to leave these coastal areas kind of to their own devices. Let them kind of change over time on their own. So there are alternatives to hard stabilization. There are construction restrictions. Hey, don't build on barrier islands, right? Then there's beach replenishment. That's really popular in Florida. A lot of our tax money, especially sales tax, that goes to paying for areas paying for companies to dump sand on our beach fronts. That happens in Melbourne, that happens in Fort Lauderdale, Miami, a lot of places. Oh, on the Keys. The Keys don't really have any natural beach deposits. It's mostly limestone there. So if you go to any of the Keys down there and you're on a beach, that's fake sand. South Beach, that's sand that's dredged up offshore and placed on the beach. So that's beach replenishment. And then there's relocation. You can actually move buildings away from the coastline to save them. Okay, so the simplest alternative is, hey, how about we don't live on barrier islands? Let's keep those in their natural state and just have them as like we can visit them. That would be a good idea. Limit the building near shorelines, but that's not what's happening. You know, people want to live really close to the beach and enjoy that. You know, they want that kind of desktop screensaver background as their reality, so they'll pay big bucks to live on the beach, and you can see that in the housing prices on the beach as a result. But I mean, people who live near the coast and on barrier islands have really high hurricane premiums, which is fair because their houses are more likely to get damaged by storm surge and hurricanes because they're on the coast. But the National Flood Insurance Program really doesn't raise the rates too much on people who are living close to the ocean and are very prone to flooding. In fact, we essentially subsidize that stuff, and it kind of incentivizes constructing near the ocean. All right, here's the example of beach replenishment. This is Miami Beach. This is Miami Beach in the 80s, the cocaine cowboy days, right? So sand is added to the beach, $5 to $10 per cubic yard. Look at this. There's nothing there, right? People are like, what's going on? But here, this is all the sand that they've added to South Beach. So they typically dredge it from the offshore bars that are out there, and then they just basically, they have like pipes that sucks it up, and then they just dump it over here. So it's pretty expensive. And then there's relocation. That's physically removing structures and moving them more inland, and that allows for more of a natural balance with beach processes. Okay, so now let's shift gears and talk about coastal waters. Okay, up until this point in this class, we've really, when we've talked about ocean circulation and ocean currents and gyres and all that stuff, we've been talking about open ocean waters. Coastal waters are really waters that are really close to the continental margins, waters where humans reside more. Okay, that's just offshore the beaches are coastal waters, relatively shallow water, right off the islands and continental shelf, broad and shallow. Okay, and in these areas there are drastic changes, or there could be drastic changes in some of the variables of the water itself, which is not reflected in the open ocean. There are changes like salinity, temperature, and there are also geostrophic currents in coastal areas. We'll talk about an example of that. All right, so salinity in coastal waters varies a lot because coastal waters are affected by river runoff, or a lot of rivers dump out into the ocean. That's fresh water. Fresh water doesn't have a lot of dissolved solids in it, so it's low density in comparison to seawater. So it doesn't really mix very well with seawater. And so what happens, or what's created, is that you just have like they're separated. Those water masses are separated by they're stratified based on their density. So fresh water will sit on top of the seawater. but you'll have a well-developed halocline. Okay, remember, if you remember pycnocline and halocline, this is the spot in the water column where there's a drastic increase or decrease in salinity. Okay, so in the example, say you have the input of fresh water from runoff, or a lot of fresh water coming off of an area, a very large river. So the coastal waters here will have lower salinity as a result. Oops. Yeah, red on red doesn't really make sense here. All right, so let's go purple. So this is all fresh water kind of sitting on top of the salty water down below. So all this input of fresh runoff lowers the salinity in this upper layer. But then once you get to a certain depth, salinity increases rapidly. Okay, and then it kind of goes into the average salinity in the ocean once you get beyond the halocline. In other situations where you have a lot of dry offshore winds, right around 30 degrees north or south latitudes, horse latitudes, there's a lot of evaporation in coastal waters, and that can actually cause an increase in salinity in coastal waters. So some coastal waters can be actually saltier than the average open ocean numbers. So you can have actually, because of the increased evaporation, really salty coastal waters. And then as you go into deeper and deeper waters, the salinity will decrease until it gets to kind of average salinity values for the open ocean. Okay, and then there are situations where you get a good balance of freshwater runoff and also a lot of evaporation. And in these areas, depending on the geometry of the coast, the tides will help mix this water really well, and you get a lot of vertical mixing that the salinity doesn't vary at all. So it's isohaline. Okay, so those are some characteristics of coastal waters. So temperature in coastal waters can affect whether or not some of these waters mix very well, because if you have higher temperature water, then that's lower density, then you have two water masses and they don't really mix. But you can have a similar situation with salinity and temperature in coastal waters. Like you can have isothermal water, and that's water that's very well mixed throughout the entire water column, has the same temperature. But you can also have water masses with varying water temperatures, and then a thermocline will develop as a result. And that's dependent on where you are on Earth, what latitude, and also on seasons. I'll show you here. But if you say you go to really high latitude areas close to land, so coastal waters, again, not in the open ocean, in these really high latitudes, like in the Arctic Circle, the temperature of the coastal waters remains uniform. Okay, and so that's very close to freezing, about 2 degrees Celsius, very low, and it's the same on the surface here or on closer to the bottom of the coastal water there. We call that isothermal. And interestingly enough, if you go closer to the equator at very low latitudes, you get the same result, but just really high temperatures. Isothermal, really high temperatures. And the reason for this is that it's really hot. There's a lot of good vertical mixing, and so the temperature at the surface is very similar to the temperature, again, and this is shallow water, much shallower than in the open ocean. But if we go into an in-between latitude, say 40 degrees north of the equator, so like right here, the coastal waters change depending on the season. In the summer, the solar radiation will heat up the upper layer of the coastal waters and make it much warmer. Okay, and then once you go to depth, then you hit the end of the thermocline and temperatures drop, and then they level off to much cooler, deeper waters. Okay, and then in the wintertime, as shown by this weird winter god blowing cold frost on the surface, you do develop a thermocline, but the opposite, where you have very cold surface waters, and as you go deeper, all of a sudden then there's a big increase in temperature. So in mid-latitudes, there is variation depending on seasons. There are also, on coastal waters, there are geostrophic currents. So remember from when we were talking about gyres, certain portions on the west side of ocean basins have like a hill of water, and then as currents approach it, They're influenced by the Coriolis effect and gravity, so that affects those geostrophic currents. But these can actually occur in coastal waters. And so what happens is a lot of fresh water runs off into the ocean, right? And this sits on top of the salty water, kind of making it a little bit higher. And then the Coriolis effect will deflect that flow of fresh water. And so one cool example of this is the Davidson Current. That's off the coast of Washington and Oregon. I've got a picture coming up. But here in the Northern Hemisphere, as we know, the Coriolis effect deflects moving masses to the right. Okay, and so on the paths are curved northward on the western coast and southward on eastern coasts. So Davidson Current's on the west coast, so it's deflected northward. So here it is. What happens is, and this typically, the currents are like this year round, the geostrophic currents or the Davidson Current, but during the spring and summer, the current's stronger because there's more water being kind of pushed through the river systems and into the ocean. So here's that kind of wedge of fresh water that kind of diminishes the further away you go from the continental margin. But as the fresh water kind of dumps into the ocean, it begins to curve to the right because of the Coriolis effect. And then that starts the Davidson Current, northward flowing coastal geostrophic current. And it moves in the opposite direction as the open ocean current, the California current. Remember, this current is, an open ocean eastern boundary current, fairly slow in comparison to western boundary currents, but still it flows in the opposite direction, which makes it kind of an interesting characteristic of places in Oregon and Washington. So there are coastal currents like that that vary from open ocean currents. All right, estuaries. Estuaries are a partially enclosed coastal body of water where you have fresh water runoff from a river kind of diluting the salty ocean water in this kind of marine environment. And pH, salinity, temperature, and water levels depend based on how well the river mixes with the ocean water and also the geometry of the enclosed area. But of our modern estuaries, most of them formed after our last glacial maximum 18,000 years ago. And there's 4 main types of estuaries, okay, and they all have a geologic origin. And I've got pictures, so I'll show you. But the coastal plain estuaries, they form as sea level rises and floods existing river valleys, okay? So that's when you're approaching like an ice age to an interglacial period. So sea levels are really low because of the ice age, but because all those glaciers are melting, sea level slowly rising, and areas that were river valleys are now being inundated by the ocean. Those become the new estuaries. And the best example of this is the Chesapeake Bay estuary, which is part of like the Maryland, Virginia, and the Potomac and the Susquehanna River dump into those areas. Okay, and so that's the main example. I'll show you a picture of what that kind of looks like. Then there are fjords, and fjords form again as sea level rises. That floods, instead of flooding river valleys, it floods valleys that used to be covered by glaciers. And when you have a valley that's covered by glaciers, they're typically U-shaped, okay? And it creates for a really interesting coastline. I'll show you some pictures, but here are the areas where there are estuaries that are like fjords, and it makes sense. Places that are really high, either elevation or in latitude. Canada, New Zealand, Chile, and Norway are areas that have fjord estuaries. Okay, so here's a cross section of a drowned river valley. Okay, so if you can imagine the entire Delaware Bay, Chesapeake Bay here, these were river valleys. Like if humans were, farming 18,000 years ago, they would have really nice farms in these river valleys here. Today, they're covered by the Atlantic Ocean. So these are the, drowned river valley estuaries. Okay, here are the fjords. Okay, fjords are typically U-shaped. Okay. And then this is where the glacier used to kind of carve through this river valley, and that's why it creates that kind of broad U shape. And what's cool about fjords is a lot of times they'll have these hanging valleys close to them. So today in Norway, you can stand on a really steep-sided cliff that looks over a marine estuary from a really high height, and they have really steep areas. I think in the book they have a really cool picture of one. The next type of estuary is called a bar-built estuary, and this is what we're familiar with in Florida. They're essentially barrier islands that are separated by the ocean with a lagoon and sand that's deposited and reworked by wave action. So there are barrier islands, lagoons. Much of the Gulf Coast and the East Coast are examples of this right here, which is the bar-built estuary. So we have sandbars essentially building up these areas, barrier islands and lagoons. And then finally we have a tectonic estuary, and these are where you have faulting and folding of rocks, which creates a down-dropped area. So this area here is down-dropped because of the upward motion of this block and the upward motion of this block, or this block is moving downwards, which creates a depression. And that is tectonic estuary because they're essentially built by the tectonic processes of an active continental margin. So the best example of this is the San Francisco Bay would be a tectonic estuary. In fact, in the last image I show you, that is a picture of the San Francisco Bay. All right, so those are the 4 different types of estuaries. So the way water mixes in estuaries, there's a number of different examples. A vertically mixed one is one where you have very low volume of water going into the estuary. So there's a net flow from the head to the mouth of the estuary, and so you get very well mixed water, fresh water and salt water together. There's slightly stratified and highly stratified, and this is where you have salinity increases from the head of the estuary to the mouth in 2 distinct layers. So these are fresh water and salt water that are distinguishable based on density. So the fresh water will sit on top of it. And then finally there's a salt wedge estuary where a wedge of salty water from the ocean kind of moves underneath the river. I've got pictures. Let me just show you. So here is the vertically mixed estuary here. This is typically, these estuaries are like this when you have very well mixed water. Okay, so good vertical mixing, aided by tides and stuff like that, and not a lot of incoming fresh water, enough to like inundate and create stratifications. Here's the slightly stratified one, and here's the highly stratified. If you notice the stratified one, here's that wedge of fresh water, and the change in salinity is rapid. Okay, you can see that. And then this is the salt wedge. So there's a huge wedge of salty water that kind of pushes itself underneath the fresh water. So that's how kind of estuaries mix with in terms of fresh and salt water. So estuaries are these areas are threatened because our human populations are close to the coastlines. A lot of the estuaries, like the Caloosahatchee area or the Indian River Lagoon on the east coast of Florida, they're affected. A lot of people will complain once we start releasing water from Lake Okeechobee. It's a lot of that water with the like blue-green algae that's really nutrient rich. That really messes up the estuaries and can cause fish kills, and it's really smelly and gunky water, low oxygen levels. So people don't like that. But the problem is that we're building around these coastal areas so much, and we have a lot of agriculture there, that the waterways often become polluted with synthetic fertilizers and pollutants and sewage that goes into the water, and that contributes to these algal blooms. So it's a big problem, especially here in Florida. Estuaries are important because there are breeding grounds for a lot of marine animals. They're the nurseries for a lot of benthic organisms and a lot of organisms that are from the open ocean or commercially fished organisms. And we can damage these environments pretty easily just by overdeveloping. All right, one example of an area that's gone really downhill especially because these are just heavily populated areas, is the Chesapeake Bay. That's a slightly stratified estuary, a drowned river mouth. And so there are huge seasonal changes in salinity, temperature, and dissolved oxygen. Dissolved oxygen is how much how much dissolved air there is in the water, which fish need to breathe, and also benthic organisms like crabs and oysters. So as the fish swims through the water, they're using up that dissolved oxygen. That's how they live, right? So what happens is a lot of times in the spring, you get a lot of water flow into the Chesapeake Bay because the Susquehanna River, the Potomac, which is over here, that dumps into these areas, but that goes through a lot of farmland, a lot of urban areas, so a lot of contaminants and fertilizers can get in the water, and that causes what we refer to as anoxic waters. Okay, and so the waters, especially in the deeper areas, they can become oxygen depleted. And the reason they become oxygen depleted is because when you have sewage and fertilizers, those are a lot of times those are like that feeds algal blooms. And why that might seem kind of good, like, oh my God, an algal bloom, that means things are going to be eating the algae and a kind of cascade of life and stuff like that. No, the problem is that if it's uncontrolled, especially with chemical fertilizers, you get huge algal blooms, right? And they proliferate so quickly, and so when they die, the bacteria uses up all the available dissolved oxygen in the water to decompose the algal blooms, and that diminishes the available oxygen, dissolved oxygen content in the water, and then the fish, the crabs in the Chesapeake Bay, I think they're the blue crabs, they're the commercially, blue crabs and oysters. Those bottom-dwelling organisms will die out, and that's significantly harmed the seafood economy in those areas. I don't know if you've ever been to Baltimore. You can have those crab cakes; they're unbelievable. But anyways, so this causes these harmful algal blooms, and that continues to be a really hot environmental issue, especially here in Florida too, because we've got those a lot of the really enriched polluted waters from Lake Okeechobee being occasionally released into the Caloosahatchee and the St. Lucie and Indian River lagoon areas. All right, speaking of lagoons, these are shallow water bodies of brackish water that are landward of barrier islands, so they're behind barrier islands. So this would be a barrier island here. So that restricts the circulation with the ocean, and so that creates three zones: freshwater zone, transitional zone, and saltwater zone. So as you approach the mouth of a lagoon, that's the saltwater zone. This would be the intermediate or transition zone, and then this would be the freshwater zone. And then also, this would be typical of Florida, right? Rainy and dry season. We're approaching the dry season. It's November, so we would have changes in the salinity levels. So because there's less precipitation and there's more evaporation and there's less incoming river water, then the salinity rates increase in all three zones. More so in the mouth because you have a bigger influence of ocean water coming in with the tides. In the rainy season, then the salinity gets suppressed, right? Which makes sense. And then here's the tidal range. Really, the tidal range is only affected in the mouth of a lagoon, which is right here. But these are interesting environments because you have a lot of salt-tolerant marine organisms and plant organisms that live in these areas. And we refer to those as wetlands. Those are ecosystems where the water table is very close to the surface and the ground is typically saturated with water. Okay, and that water can either be, it can be coastal or brackish water, or even fresh water. Okay, and so coastal wetlands occur along the margins of coastal waters, estuaries, lagoons, and marginal seas, and they include swamps, tidal flats, coastal marshes, and bayous. Okay. All right, the first type of coastal wetland is called a salt marsh. You might not be as familiar with these because these occur a little further north than where we are, between 30 and 65 degrees latitude, north and south of the equator. And so salt marshes essentially, they support salt tolerant grasses and other halophytic low-lying plants. Those are just salt tolerant plants, the fancy word for that. And they occur along many coastlines. A lot of them deal with the salt in different ways. For example, some of them get rid of excess salt by producing salt crystals on their leaves. Okay. Some of them accumulate salt in their tissues and dispose of it by breaking those tissues off into the water itself. All right, so here's a typical saltwater marsh in Morro Bay, California. So it's a flat-lying area. Great stopping point for a lot of migrating birds. Okay. Then there are mangroves. You might be more familiar with this. We have this in Florida. Mangrove swamps are really restricted to tropical regions, so below 30 degrees latitude and towards the equator. Here you find salt-tolerant mangrove trees that kind of grow their roots downwards into the mud or sediment. You have shrubs, palms, and they form like that tripod-type root system, which is fairly typical. In the book, they've got some really nice images of the root systems from mangrove trees kind of coming downwards and into these kind of brackish and salty environments. So you find them in the Caribbean, Florida, and most extensively in Southeast Asia. Let's see, we got a picture here. So anything that's in brown would be a salt marsh. So we see that on the East Coast of the United States and Gulf Coast, and also Pacific Coast. And then once you get down to lower latitudes, then you start running into the mangroves. That's Caribbean, Yucatan, West Coast of Central America and Mexico. And again, in this portion, in Southeast Asia, we see a lot of mangroves over here. So coastal wetlands are very important. They're a home to a very diverse assortment of plants and animals, and they're very productive ecosystems. They're the most productive on Earth. And when they're kind of left undisturbed, they provide a lot of economic benefits that we don't really give them credit for. Salt marshes, as an example, they serve as nurseries for almost half of the species of commercially important fishes in the southeastern United States. So a lot of the fish that we depend on to commercially fish, they get their starting points at those salt marshes. Okay, so some of those include oysters, scallops, clams, eels, and smelt. Those come from marshes. From mangrove ecosystems, these are also wetlands. They're kind of nurseries for very commercially valuable shrimp, prawn, shellfish, and many other species. And these wetland areas are also really great stopping or stopover points for migrating birds that are going into different, when they come down for winter or they go north for summer, or whatever it is their migrating pattern is. These wetlands are great areas for them to stop over, rest, get a bite to eat, or something like that. In addition to that, if you ever go to any of the mangroves, a lot of them will be places where a lot of birds nest certain times of years. So that's really important as well. In addition to that, coastal wetlands, they soak up a lot of nutrients that run off of farmlands and also from rivers. So they soak up because they're so productive, they soak up all that stuff before they get into coastal waters and to coastal estuaries. And those pollutants and nutrients, that's what fuels those harmful algal blooms and creates those oxygen-free dead zones that we were talking about earlier. So amazingly, wetlands are kind of like akin to our kidneys. They're like nature's kidneys. So wetlands can filter out kind of polluted, nutrient-rich water before it goes out into the ocean, which is really good. In addition to that, a lot of wetlands, they protect the inland areas of the United States from erosion, from wave activity. those, tripod-like roots that just go directly into the mud and sediment in these kind of coastal areas really diminish the wave activity of incoming storms and stuff like that, which are really valuable at protecting inland areas. So they dissipate a lot of coastal wave energy. And they also prevent flooding from storm surges because they can absorb a lot of that excess water. So wetlands are very important, and we're just starting to realize that now. Sadly, though, more than half of the U.S. wetlands have vanished, right? We've filled and developed them, put up cookie cutter homes and houses and stuff like that. I mean, we have to live somewhere, right? But maybe not destroying wetlands would probably be a good idea, because it just provides so many valuable resources to the area surrounding it, as well as marine life and bird life and stuff like that. The EPA is actually, since 1986, they established an office of the Wetlands Protection Program, and that helps slow down the destruction of wetlands, and new areas have become like water conservation areas to help with the cleansing of water before they go out into the ocean. But still, we're growing as a population so quickly. And in addition to that, sea level is rising, so we're expecting further wetland loss, which is bad, right? And here's just a visual of how much wetland land we've lost, over since this is the continental United States. Undisturbed wetlands, we had about 87 million hectares, and then through human activities, only about 106 million acres are left. So we're kind of the bad guys here. We're the ones kind of clearing out the natural coastal environment because we want to live closer to the ocean. But there are movements to kind of restore and conserve the wetland areas because it is for our own good. So there is some light at the end of the tunnel there. All right, thanks for sticking with me for an hour and a half. Maybe you broke that up, but yeah, cheers.